Well, thank you very much for inviting me this morning. I think it's been a fantastically interesting morning, particularly in that I've been involved with this work in Taiwan now for quite a while, it seems, and it's really interesting to see how things are beginning to come together. And it's also interesting for me to look at how all of the speakers this morning basically have said what I'm going to say in the next 15 minutes. So I hope, take a slightly different perspective on it, and I hope to stand back a little bit from the chalk face, so to speak, and to think a little bit about the broader organization of what we're doing. And I think to give a little bit of more positivity, I guess, not that people before me were not positive, but I'm kind of an internal optimist, and I always try to look at the bright side of things. And I do think that there are some very positive things to be gained from this whole approach. I think it's a fantastically exciting innovation to start to even consider. So my slides have frozen, so I'm going to see if I can stop sharing for a moment and come back in. Let's see if I can make that happen properly. Yes, I'm going to. Can you see this second slide?
Yes.
Great. So some of you will have heard me talk before about this idea of the comprehensive learning system. For me, it's been really hammered home through all of the talks I've been hearing this morning, how important all of these various different elements of the system are, and how important it is that the various elements of the system work together in a coherent and cohesive fashion so that the system can work. Essentially, the system consists of three elements: the curriculum, the delivery of the curriculum, and the assessment within the system. Now, I've always come to this from the assessment side, but over the last number of years, I've had to think about it more and more from the other elements. How does assessment fit in with the system? Because for many years, I would go to teacher conferences and would not be greeted with great welcome in many cases, because people had this dislike or even fear of assessment. And I began to think about it seriously, because I realized that assessment really didn't fit in it with how people considered the system, whereas I always felt it was a critical part of the system. So just to explain very quickly what I mean by all of this, we have the curriculum that should be driven by comprehensive language standards or a language framework such as the CAFR. Now, some countries like China have the China Standards of English. In Japan, they have the CEFR-J, which is a localized version of the CEFR. And something like that, in my opinion, needs to drive the whole system so that it lends a systematicity, if you like, to all of the elements within the system. Of course, it's got to be the curriculum itself, as you all know, it needs to be context appropriate. We need to think about nowadays different types of learning, both school learning and home learning in formal situations, and then informal learning, which we find more and more through things like apps, TV films, games, etc. So our concept, I believe, of the curriculum needs to broaden now from the old style of looking at a curriculum as what happens in the classroom, excuse me, to looking at what happens beyond the classroom into the whole learning experience of the individual. In terms of delivery, we've heard a lot from Tim just now about the importance of the teacher in all of this. And also he touched on it at one point, and I think Mark did as well, on the importance of leadership. And I have to say that it was Tim brought the idea of bringing leadership into all of this model to me, because we need to think about the delivery, how we deliver that curriculum in all kinds of ways. We need to think about it from the teaching perspective, of course, the materials for the formal textbooks, the teacher made, etc. We need to think about the physical environment. Are the rooms built to allow the kind of communication to happen? For example, my experience of that was teaching communication to 140 nurses in Japan many years ago in a room that had 140 seats nailed to the floor, so nobody could move, and it was a nightmare and a bit of a disaster, I think. We also have to think, as I said earlier, about leadership, and leadership at all levels, from departmental to school to regional to national, right through the system. We need to build leadership towards the goal that we're aiming for. So we've got to bring these people along, because they're the people who are going to help to transmit an enthusiasm for the system and for the innovation right throughout the system, down to the teachers and to the learners themselves, of course. We also need to think about how informal learning can be affected. And we know that in some countries, for example, there have been moves to even on television to get rid of dubbed programs and foreign programs. Now I've noticed in many countries, including even the UK now, and especially I guess through Netflix, are using subtitles. So you're actually exposed to the language. And it's been quite interesting for in my house, because my wife very much likes her French, and she's been catching up on French through watching some French programs, and I've been doing a bit of Spanish. So it's been really a fascinating idea to think that you can actually use these opportunities to continue to develop your language, at least in a passive way, I guess. In terms of assessment, we have to think about it from all different aspects. We need to think of high stakes summative assessment, and that all of these have to be appropriate. They have to be fit within our system. It has another fit, which I'll talk about in a moment. But also medium stakes and formative assessment should also fit. And the note that I like to remind people here is, when I think about summative, I say that's a judgmental. When I make a judgment about a person, if I give them a score or a grade, that's summative. If it's formative, it's developmental. And for me, you never test, you never score or award a grade to a formative test. Otherwise, it becomes summative. I know what I'm like. If I think there's a score involved, I'm going to do my best to get the score. I'm not going to show my actual language. I want to pass the test, basically. Of course, all of this happens within a context of use. And of course, in your situation, we're looking at Taiwan as a context of use. And I think we need, when we're looking at our comprehensive learning system, it has to be developed within a development model, a language development model, and a measurement model. We need underlying measurement and data to drive our system, as well as all of our theoretical movement as we progress through language learning. One of the reasons for this is the whole movement towards learning and towards the documentation of learning is creating a data environment, if you like, that many countries ignore or don't make the best use of. Some countries overuse it, I think. So it's a fine balance between understanding what's happening within the system and giving evidence of what's happening within the system to demonstrate that the system is actually working. Of course, to deal with stakeholders, as we've heard of earlier, we need a theory of action. We need a very clear plan. That's the theory of action. How are we going to make this whole thing happen? How are we going to make it work? We can't just make that plan without interaction with the stakeholders involved, and those in a national system like Taiwan will include a vast number of people, of course, but we need to learn how to communicate to them. I've been working recently a lot in the area of test validity theory and validity and validation, And I've come to the conclusion essentially that a lot of validity and validation is a myth. It's a sort of a concept that has been driven by academics for academics, and in some countries for legal experts. But the reality is that it has little to do with stakeholders. We've got to change that. We've got to remove that imbalance and move it so that we bring the stakeholders into the system. The big question that we have been talking about here, of course, is English as a medium of instruction. That we have to commit. If we're going to do it, we've got to commit to it, because one of the problems we have that English and other languages, when we look at them in school systems, they tend to be seen as a subject. So it's language as academic knowledge. So it's like counting boxes and remembering things, as opposed to language as and for communication. Now we're talking about the bottom one here, but we have to be very clear that from the beginning that that's the point of introducing it. Otherwise, nothing is going to work. I'm going to take a quick reflection again on the Spanish experience, because I was very much involved in the English impact study that we had in Madrid. We used not the whole of the country, as you can see, we just looked at Madrid. And Madrid has what I would call a hybrid system. It has bilingual and non-bilingual schools, and Mark talked a bit about this earlier. I was interested in thinking from the perspective of Taiwan, what are the things that might be of interest? Well, I thought, well, how about looking at motivated behavior, at motivation, the whole area of motivation that we looked at in Taiwan as well as in Spain. And I thought, would there be differences across the different people who were involved in bilingual or non-bilingual? And you can see that in many of the cases, there's no difference at all. You don't need to be a statistician or a rocket scientist to figure that one out. Those graphs all look the same, more or less, to me. However, there were some differences, not massive, but some differences in just two areas. And those two areas had related to the self, the ideal self and the English self, which I thought was an interesting one, because those are quite difficult to get at. So in many ways, motivation doesn't seem to have been a huge problem with the Spanish students that we looked at. In fact, when we looked at their skills, we noticed that there were, as Mark mentioned earlier, significant differences in terms of language skills across the groups for all of the four skills. So the bilinguals, as we might have hoped, performed quite a lot better. Mark also reminded us that the ministry in Spain at that time had undertaken some of their own research looking at performance on other subjects through English, and found that in the early years there was a fall off, that the people tended not to perform as well as their peers who were studying those subjects in Spanish. However, by the time they got to school leaving age, they were at least at the same level, if not surpassing them. So it shows to me that the bilingual system did work, and it can work. But I draw your attention as well to the blue bits here, the non-bilingual. And it shows that with a systematic approach to English language education within the system, which it wasn't just ignored in Spain, there was this systematic approach. You can see that there's quite a reasonably high level of performance, certainly across most of the subject areas at the B1 level, which is independent user, which is quite a high level of language to have reached. And we've heard from some of the speakers today that, well, that may well be enough to get people started into a system, into an EMI system. It certainly is something that gives us encouragement, and it seems to me that that is a one strikingly encouraging sign. So if we think about it then, bilingual and multilingual education can work well, I believe. I think the data from Spain certainly shows that. But it works well when it's seen as part of a whole system innovation. And a whole system innovation can see gain across the system, but it takes careful planning, it takes a lot of hard work, and more than anything else, it takes a massive amount of time. We saw from the Spain experience, we had an event there a few weeks back to celebrate the 25th anniversary. So these things don't happen slowly, it takes time. Thank you very much.